No mai ki Aotearoa.
Tau mai ki Tāmaki Makaurau.
Ko te reo rangatira, te reo rāhere i te hunga e ua ana ki te taonga rererangi o Tāmaki.
Tākina rā kupu anga e toia nei a matariki ki te pai.
40 years ago, hearing Maori spoken in public like this was much less common and surprising. Today you can hear it on television, in schools, at government events, even on airport announcements. So, how did a language that was once predicted to disappear become one of the most successful examples of language revitalization in the world? Hi everyone, I'm Olivia. Welcome back to Who Gets to Keep Their Language. In the previous episodes, we have talked about language death, endangered languages, and how political decisions can shape which languages survive and which do not. Today, we are looking at a very different political story, a story not of language loss, but of language recovery. We are talking about Te Reo Maori, the indigenous language of Aotearoa, New Zealand, a language that came dangerously close to disappearing, and a language that is now experiencing one of the most remarkable revitalization movements that is being witnessed by the world. Later in this episode, I will also be speaking with Paul from New Zealand, who has experience with Maori language and culture in everyday life. But first, let's go back to the beginning. Who are the Maori? Long before Europeans arrived in New Zealand, Maori ancestors traveled across the Pacific Ocean. Most historians and archaeologists believe that they arrived around the 13th century, which was roughly 700 to 800 years ago. They were extraordinary navigators. Using stars, ocean currents, winds, and environmental knowledge, Polynesian voyagers crossed thousands of kilometers of open ocean in large ocean-going canoes known as waka. Eventually, they reached Aotearoa, which is the Maori name for New Zealand. The phrase is often translated as the land of the long white cloud. Once they arrived, Maori communities settled throughout both the North and South Islands of New Zealand. Over generations, different iwi or tribal groups developed their own traditions, histories, and local identities. Te Reo Maori became the language through which knowledge, genealogy, history, spirituality, stories, music, and identity were passed down from the elders to the children. For centuries, Maori society flourished. Then the Europeans arrived. The first recorded European arrival was Dutch explorer Abel Tasman in 1642. Later, British explorer James Cook arrived in 1769. Throughout the late 18th and 19th centuries, increasing numbers of European settlers came to New Zealand. At first, relationships between Maori and Europeans were complex. There was trade, there was cooperation, there was cultural exchange, but there was also conflict. As settler populations increased, competition over land and resources became more intense. In 1840, representatives of the British Crown and many Maori chiefs from different parts of New Zealand signed the Treaty of Waitangi, or in Maori, Te Tiriti o Waitangi. Today, it is often described as New Zealand's founding document. However, the English and Maori versions of the treaty were not identical. Different interpretations emerged almost immediately. Many Maori believed they were agreeing to share governance while retaining authority over their lands and communities. The British government interpreted the treaty differently. From the British perspective, the treaty transferred sovereignty or ultimate political authority over New Zealand to the British Crown. In other words, they believed Maori chiefs had agreed to place the country under British rule, while still retaining ownership of certain lands and property. These disagreements would shape New Zealand history and sense of identity for generations to come. As colonization expanded, Maori communities experienced major social and economic changes. Land was confiscated. Traditional structures were disrupted. English increasingly became the language of education, government policies and documents, legal system, and economic opportunities. By the 20th century, many Maori children were being discouraged or punished for speaking Maori at school. Does this power imbalance sound familiar? If you have listened to our previous episodes about Ainu and Ryukyuan languages, you will recognize a very similar pattern. The goal was assimilation. The belief was that speaking English would help Maori children become successful members of society. But assimilation came with consequences. Language transmission between generations began to weaken. Parents who had experienced discrimination sometimes chose not to pass the language on to their children in order to break the toxic cycle of discrimination and unfairness. By the 1970s, the situation had become critical. Some researchers warned that Te Reo Maori could disappear within a few generations. Now, at this point, some people might ask, why does it matter? If everyone can communicate in English, why preserve Maori? For Maori communities, the language is much more than a communication tool. It carries concepts and ways of understanding their history and the current world. Ideas like wanau, extended family and community, mana, prestige, authority, dignity and respect, kaitiakitanga, guardianship and responsibility toward the environment. These concepts do not translate perfectly into English. They are tied to a particular history, tradition, customs, ideology, and worldview. It represents a particular relationship between people, community, ancestors, and nature. When a language disappears, those perspectives can become harder to pass on. And that is one reason language revitalization became so important. To better understand what Maori language and culture look like today, I wanted to hear from someone with first-hand experience in New Zealand. So I asked a few questions about how Te Reo Maori is used in everyday life, how Maori ideas, practices, and perspectives are taught in schools, and what the future of revitalization might look like for New Zealand as a country.
Hi, I'm Olivia, and I will be interviewing Paul Barrett from New Zealand. So, Paul, can you introduce yourself and tell us your expertise, please?
Kia ora, my name is Paul Barrett, ko Paul toku ingoa. That's how you say it in Te Reo Maori. So my approach to the study of Te Reo Maori, which is the Maori language, a Maori culture is from both an academic and holistic professional perspective. So I actually have Maori ancestry, or as we say in Te Reo, a whakapapa, which means I can trace my lineage back through 3 different iwi or tribes. So one of them is Ngāti Mutonga, which comes from the Taranaki region on the west coast of the North Island of New Zealand. The other one is Ngāi Tahu, which is the South Island, most of the South Island of New Zealand, or Aotearoa, as we say in Te Reo. And also Whaori Kōri, otherwise known as the Chatham Islands, which is a small couple of islands, which is about a few hundred kilometres off the coast of the east coast of New Zealand. So I'm currently pursuing advanced multimedia and Te Reo studies at Auckland University of Technology. So this has basically been my first foray into actually learning the language. So I moved back from overseas about 4 years ago. I spent a lot of time in Australia, South America. So actually learning the language at university and also applying that with my digital marketing and media skills in terms of creating content specifically for Māori audiences as well as audiences in general. This has been really interesting for me, not just in terms of learning more about the culture, but also how it can be used in more of a professional sort of context as well. And I also work as an integrative counselor, so I have another background in psychology. So yeah, I really enjoy working with people. Like I said, I've lived overseas quite a lot, so really love learning new cultures, travel, experiencing. And it's been a great honor to actually, come back to my home country and actually start learning the language that my ancestors spoke. My relationship with the Te Reo, or the language, is deeply tied to understanding communication, cultural identity, and the ways in which language actually shapes our social and media landscapes right here in Aotearoa, New Zealand.
Thank you. So, talking about Maori, how is Te Reo used in everyday life context, for example, in schools, libraries, like supermarkets in New Zealand?
Yeah, so what we have here in New Zealand now is like bilingualism. So around 1987, the language was actually elevated to the same level as English. And in recent years, there's been a big push to actually integrate the language more into everyday life. It's driven mainly by the government. So not so much this current government, but the last government, they devoted a lot of effort to actually changing some of the official names of government ministries to the Te Reo version of that. And I live in Auckland, and this is most evident too, like when catching public transport, like trains or buses, like they'll actually announce the Māori name of the place before the English name. Similarly, many street names are actually Māori names, many public signs, say, for example, exit Putanga, especially in Auckland, they actually have the Māori name most prominent, and then like the English translation or the English equivalent underneath. So it's increasingly visible and audible in everyday spaces, which is great. It's really helped me to practice the language and get more used to actually hearing it. Like every time like I catch public transport, like I was saying, it's actually getting reinforced in my mind, just hearing the proper pronunciation of that. So we've got to the point now in modern Aotearoa New Zealand where it's moved far beyond just being used on the traditional marae, which is like the Māori meeting places where they gather, have official gatherings of people. And so taking it a step further in schools and libraries, a lot of schools in New Zealand are now called kohanga reo, which is like a language nest. So they're actually immersion Māori schools. So young people actually have the opportunity, if they have Māori parents, to actually go into these schools and learn the entire curriculum in the Māori language. Also in mainstream schools as well, students can opt to actually study Te Reo right from sometimes primary school, but more commonly in high school. And it's actually integrated into daily routines through karakia, which is like sort of like a prayer or showing respect to open the day. Waiata, which is like songs and music. So I remember even, when I was back at primary school and stuff, we actually learned how to sing Māori songs that taught us, some of the key vocabulary related to colors, numbers, all that kind of thing. And also the use of Māori concepts as they guide behavioural frameworks. Public libraries feature bilingual signage similar to like public transport and government ministries. And storytelling sessions frequently weave bilingual narratives into, the narratives that they're trying to tell. Supermarkets and retail similarly, there's bilingual signage quite often. So for example, ika for fish, miraka for milk. Quite often too, like in public, people actually use Māori greetings like kia ora. And for cultural and community events, there's major national events now like Matariki, which is the Māori New Year. It actually got made into a public holiday back a few years ago now, within the last 5 years. So that's normally around June. So Matariki is like the Pleiades in English, like that star cluster. There's 7 stars. And so now that's celebrated nationwide by people of all backgrounds. So New Zealand is a very diverse multicultural nation. So even, people who weren't actually born here, it's embedded and weaves so much into the culture now that even a lot of non-New Zealand born people are actually making the effort to actually learn the language, get involved with the culture. It's standard practice for community gatherings, public broadcasts, and corporate events to open with a mihi, which is like a greeting or an acknowledgement of the mana whenua. So, the land, the local indigenous people who live upon it.
Thank you. So you mentioned about the school being the nest, but the NCEA is gonna change to a newer one, right? And what do we know and think about Maori beliefs and concepts being introduced in NCEA learning for students in subjects such as English and science?
Yeah, this has been quite a controversial topic because the current government is actually restructuring the way that assessment's being done. They want to change the curriculum and everything as well too. But from what I understand, the integration of Māori concepts into the NCEA, particularly Motoronga Māori, which is the Maori knowledge systems, it's an evolving and highly discussed topic in education. So in terms of the English language, it enriches the curriculum by introducing students to unique literary frameworks, oral storytelling traditions, whakatoki, which are short stories or proverbs that offer deep metaphoric insight into human psychology and relationships. And then in relationship to science, the introduction of Motoronga Māori emphasizes a holistic observation-based understanding of the natural world accumulated over centuries. So this relates to, the study of the moon cycles, all that kind of thing as well. It's also sparked academic debate regarding where traditional Indigenous knowledge intersects with empirical Western science. And many educators and thinkers view it as a powerful way to teach ecological sustainability, biodiversity, and local environmental systems. We also have what's called te whare tapawha, which is you can imagine a house with 2 walls, and then you've got the roof like that, and then the ground. That's like the holistic Māori model of health and wellness. So we've got whenua, which is the ground or the land. So that's like the foundation of everything. On one side, we've got tinana, which is like the physical or the body. The other side, we've got whānau, which is like family, friends, social connections. And then the 2 points of the roof, we've got hinengaro, which is like the mental, emotional side of things. And then we've also got wairua, which is like the spirit or the soul or the creator source energy. And so the belief is that for the house to be strong, all of those sides and the roof, and especially the foundation, all need to support each other. And so if one part of that is out of balance, that's going to affect the whole house.
Okay. So the next question is that what has made the government of New Zealand include Te Reo Maori language for travel and tourism purposes?
Yeah, so the inclusion of Te Reo Maori in travel and tourism serves two primary purposes, so authenticity and cultural preservation. So first, the global tourism market highly values authentic, unique Indigenous experiences. And thankfully for New Zealand, like it punches above its weight in terms of its profile on the international stage. So many people have actually been exposed to Māori culture, whether it be through the haka being performed by the All Blacks in rugby games, Māori's waiata music as well has been around for a long time, has reached international markets. So when in New Zealand, for example, they use Kia ora or National Tourism Campaign centre on manaakitanga, which is like hospitality or welcoming people. It sets Aotearoa apart on the world stage. So second, the government realises and recognises that tourism is a powerful vehicle for language revitalisation. So by embedding Te Reo into national transport, signage and international marketing, it kind of like normalizes the language domestically while signalling to the world that Māori culture is a living, breathing and foundational pillar of the nation's identity.
So Te Reo Maori is already a successful language in the case of revitalization, but what other steps can the government take in the upcoming future to ensure that people from different cultures can understand or speak like basic Maori language?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And like I was saying before, like New Zealand has a very multicultural population. So to ensure that everyone, including the recent immigrants and other cultures that make up a part of our country, can access and understand basic Te Reo, the government could focus on a few key structural areas. So first of all, like accessible digital and media learning. So this would involve leveraging media ecology, digital art to create immersive, gamified language apps and interactive public media that make learning low pressure and highly engaging for adult migrants. Also, too, like subsidized and community education. So there was a time where even at university you could study Te Reo Māori for free. The current government has been cutting back on that sort of funding. But also, localized culturally inclusive Te Reo evening courses specifically tailored for new citizens and diverse community hubs. All of these things, like the government could have an active role in not just funding, but supporting in other ways. Bilingual public infrastructure. So like I talked about before, especially with public transport, official naming, signage. So moving past basic greetings towards fully bilingual public transport announcements, digital civic services, which not just reinforces the context, but also, like I was saying before with my own experience, just hearing the correct pronunciation. So it's like passive learning in daily life. And then they could also focus on connecting cultures. So this would involve highlighting the structural and philosophical parallels between Māori concepts and the traditional values of other migrant cultures, such as shared values around family, respect for elders, and connection to the land. So making the language feel familiar and welcoming to everyone.
Thank you, Paul. And that's the end of the interview. So thank you.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
One thing that stood out to me from that interview is how visible Maori has become. But that visibility did not happen by accident. It was the result of decades of activism that was implementing by the Maori people in unity. In the 1970s and 1980s, Maori activists began demanding stronger protections and rights for the language. One major turning point came in 1982 with the creation of Kohanga Reo. These were Maori language immersion preschools. The idea was simple. If children were not learning Maori at home anymore, they needed places where they could learn and practice it naturally. The movement expanded rapidly. Soon there were Maori medium schools, Maori radio stations, Maori television, teacher training programs, language resources such as poems, songs, and advertisement banners, and in 1987 Te Reo Maori was recognized as an official language of New Zealand. That was a huge moment, not just legally, symbolically. It signaled that Maori language, customs, and identity were part of New Zealand's future, not just its past. One of the most visible Maori traditions internationally is the haka. Many people know it through New Zealand rugby, but haka is much more than a sports performance. Traditionally, haka can be used to welcome guests, celebrate achievements, express grief, communal power, honor ancestors, and unite a community. It is a powerful expression of cultural identity, and I think that is one reason it resonates with people around the world, because it is not simply being preserved in a museum. It is still alive, still evolving, still meaningful. And that is really the goal of language revitalization too, not preserving a language like a historical artifact, but allowing it to continue living amongst the current and the next generations of people. So what can other countries learn from the Maori and what New Zealand has experienced? First, language loss is not inevitable. Second, revitalization takes time and constant communal effort. And third, schools alone are not enough. Successful revitalization requires families, communities, educators, governments, and media all working together towards achieving the goal. Most importantly, people need to believe that the language has value in their modern life, not just historical value, present day and future generations' value. When I studied in New Zealand, one of the things that surprised me most was how naturally Maori language and culture appeared in everyday life. Not everywhere, but visibly, such as road signs and on public transportations. I also learned and sung some waiata, the Maori songs, at school, and that visibility matters, because languages survive when people hear them, use them, and see them as part of the future. The story of Te Reo Maori reminds us that endangered languages do not always disappear. Sometimes they recover, sometimes they grow, and sometimes they become powerful examples for the rest of the world. Thank you so much for listening. I will see you in the next episode, where we will explore another fascinating language story, Yiddish, a language that survived without a country of its own.